So first of all, I would like to welcome everybody to this is our first talk of 2026. And I know that the year is somehow only a month old, and yet it feels like a century has passed. So I don't know what that means for the rest of the year, but we will see. This is a very exciting talk for us. We're very honored to have with us today Dr. David Smilde, who's the top expert in Venezuela and U.S.-Venezuela relations. And not only is he, of course, a very important and renowned scholar, but he's somebody who does, as you've been hearing, speak extensively to the media and publish a lot in the public discourse, which is, something that's very, very important for all of us. Currently, Dr. Smilde is the Charles A. and Leo M. Favrot Professor of Human Relations and the Chair of the Department of Sociology and the Senior Associate at the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research at Tulane University. He has also served as the Senior Fellow for Venezuela at the Washington Office on Latin America, has been a participant in the Wilson Center for Scholars at the Venezuelan Working Group, and of course has testified to the U.S. Senate on Foreign Relations Committee. He has studied Venezuela for over 30 years, having lived in the country for most of that time. And his academic work is deeply grounded in kind of ethnographic and decolonial method. So he really aims to accurately explain and portray the internal logics of both Chavismo, but also the Venezuelan opposition movement. So trying to understand really kind of what these two movements are about instead of as what often happens in the discourse as one side or the other is just dismissed as kind of crazy and is illogical. He has authored or edited 5 books and over 30 peer-reviewed articles on the country of Venezuela, and is a frequent media contributor with opinion pieces in New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and El País. And today, Dr. Smilde is here to kind of help us understand kind of the current conflict, which obviously, the situation already has changed so much since, the time at the end of the semester when we had reached out to coordinate this. So we're very, very excited to have him here. And there'll be plenty of time after the presentation for questions. And as you guys all already know, when we get to the question and answer portion, you can use the raise your hand function to speak, or you can chat into the chat and we'll help you read your questions. But unless there's anything else, we're really happy to kind of turn the microphone over to you, Dr. Smilde, and hear your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Kasia, and thank you, Gisela, for this invitation. It's an honor for me to be here with you. And we were just chatting beforehand that, I've done a ton of media interviews and work, which are all sort of just, with sort of minimal preparation, just reading what's going on and talking to people and then talking to the media. And so I haven't really had a chance for an extended sort of presentation or engagement on this since January 3rd. This is kind of my first attempt at this, and so I'm really looking forward to this, to be able to present some ideas a little bit longer form and get some feedback from fellow academics and from students. So okay, so let me just kind of arrange myself. I'm going to share my screen here, and to do that, I'm using 2 screens here. So I'm going to bring this over here. Oh, it's not allowing me. Anyway, okay, let me just share. It says sharing is not turned on. Okay, I can't, you're muted, so I can't hear you, but.
Sorry. Gisela, I think you have to enable the sharing because you're the host. Oh, let me see here.
I just made you a co-host.
Okay.
Yes. So you should.
Okay, now it's working. Okay. There you go. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it like in the PowerPoint with everything. You can still put it in the
presentation mode.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. All right, so here we go. And I have you guys here in the corner. If I'm looking over this way, it's because I'm looking at you. And here I'm looking at my presentation. So, okay, let me get started with here. Okay, so first of all, just to kind of explain the perspective that I work from. No, I work a lot on international relations. I'm working on the United States and Venezuela. That's what I talk about to the media. That's what a lot of our scholarship is about recently. But I'm not actually an IR scholar. No, I'm a sociologist, and I'm actually originally an ethnographer, and but I've sort of become a comparative historical, political sociologist. And the way I think about what I'm doing is in terms of what's called global historical sociology. And so I just wanted to kind of start with this to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, why it might sound a little bit different than what you might hear from an IR scholar. International relations is, of course, what usually talks about international relations, about the relationship between countries, and it tends to have as its unit of analysis the nation state. No, that is the sort of the primordial unit of analysis. You look at relationships between Venezuela, the United States, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Um, in global historical sociology tends to focus more on subnational phenomena. So it tends to think more in terms of things like corporations, like political parties, NGOs, classes, even families or professional networks, political networks, as well as states. We don't ignore states at all. We think about state formations, but we think of them as historical phenomena and don't take them as sort of a unified subject analysis, but as something that forms and is weaker or stronger. The sort of the main concepts that you will see, with international relations, you talk about perspectives, realism versus idealism versus constructivism, and key terms like balancing. In global historical sociology, we tend to use more classic historical sociological terms, capitalism, markets, imperialism, state formation, inequality, looking at networks. Those are sort of the concepts that we end up using, even though we're kind of oftentimes looking at the same phenomena that an IR scholar would look at. The substantive methodological focus of IR tends to be trying to figure out what are sort of the causal constructions that you can distill from a number of cases and say, well, this is something that's out there that, could not necessarily timeless, but that goes across many contexts. In global historical sociology, focuses much more on sort of the development of unique historical configurations. It's more historical, no? Global historical sociology flows out of historical sociology, and so which is sort of a little bit more conceptual than history, but I think less conceptual than IR usually is, and much of sociology is. So, and just to give you an idea, the key metaphor, sort of the key adjective, I guess you would say for IR is international, no? Whereas for global historical sociology, the key um, sort of adjective is intersocial, no? And I say all this, this is not going to be an exercise in which I attempt to demonstrate global historical sociology or argue for it. I love IR. I read IR all the time. I'm just going through this just to kind of explain to you, the perspective from which I work. And oftentimes, and why the concepts might be a little bit different. Sometimes I get people that afterwards are like, well, is this a realist perspective or a constructivist perspective? And I say, well, actually, I'm just really working with those terms. Okay. So I'm going to start with just a tale of two elections. So this is historical, but it's actually, I'm really just going to be looking at the past 2 years. So in 2024, both Venezuela and the United States had presidential elections. The Venezuela elections, I followed very closely. I was in Venezuela for much of that period. This was a really a really heady period in which in 2023, Maria Corina Machado, who's long been an opposition leader, but is somebody who traditionally was a little bit marginal in the opposition. She was sort of to the right of the leading coalition. While the leading coalition would go to elections and participate in dialogues and negotiations with Chavismo, she was often saying, don't you don't negotiate with criminals, you can't negotiate with dictators, and she led a number of boycotts. She participated in some elections, but she more often she boycotted elections and sort of led boycotts that really suppressed turnout. But in 2023, she was convinced by the idea of participating, and she participated in she really promoted and participated in an opposition primary that she won with over 90%. Of course, a number of the candidates had withdrawn, but they withdrew because they knew she was going to win. And she becomes becomes the presidential candidate. This whole election, this moving to election was sort of brokered by the United States, by the Biden administration in the Barbados, Qatar Accords, that basically said if Chavismo held real elections, the U.S. and met several sort of thresholds, the U.S. would reduce sanctions. So we said, okay, we're going to go for it. In Maria Corina Machado, of course, her candidacy is then basically disqualified. She names another substitute candidate. That candidate is disqualified, and then she names Edmundo Gonzalez, who is a retired former diplomat who Chavismo allows to run. I think they basically thought that he was not going to be able to, generate as much enthusiasm. But Machado really campaigned hard all over the country with Edmundo Gonzalez, very much made it clear that he was her candidate. And lo and behold, in July, the end of July, 28th of July, he wins the election. He basically duplicates Nicolas Maduro's vote, almost 70% of the vote. Maduro had, less than 35% of the vote. But of course, what happens with the Chavismo does not recognize this election. They basically say, no, we won the election. It's one of the sort of the most obscene and sort of cumbersome, clumsy electoral thefts in the history of Latin America. No, and they don't convince really anybody. And that that was kind of a turning point. At that point, Machado sort of goes back to her old message and basically says, we can't go to more elections. We need international intervention. And she doesn't actually call for military intervention. She calls for more sanctions, more pressure, recognition of Edmundo Gonzalez as president, sort of a reiteration of the 2019 strategy of the interim government. So that is kind of the strategy of the fall, And remember, at this time, Biden is president. Nobody really knows who's going to win. Kamala Harris is the candidate. When Trump is elected, well, let me just jump over the U.S. presidential elections first. So 2024, Trump, of course, is candidate. He's focusing, if you remember his master narrative of his candidacy, is a focus on immigration. And immigration is the cause. He portrays immigrants as bringing drugs, crime, and violence in the United States, says that Joe Biden has left the borders open, and that's what's bringing drugs, crime, and violence in the United States. Even though violence rates and crime rates have been dropping, he really uses this message, and he says immigrants are also behind economic stagnations. It's because immigrants are coming and taking your jobs that wages are low and prices are high. So it's all about immigration. In September 2024, if you can imagine August being this moment in which Venezuela is in the news continually about this obscene electoral theft, and as Maria Corina Machado being marginalized or being robbed of an election, and Edmundo Gonzalez being robbed of an election, Venezuela's in the news. He starts in early September. He starts to mention the Tren de Aragua. He mentions it in a presidential debate. He then mentions it. Then he goes and has a rally in Aurora, Colorado. And in September and October, he pretty much mentions the Tren de Aragua, which he would pronounce Tren de Aragua, as sort of the, he mentions almost every one of the speeches. For him, it's the perfect metaphor for the idea of Biden's open border allowing immigrants to come in and bringing crime and violence and chaos. No? Okay, so of course Trump is elected in November. In January, now going back over to the other column on the left-hand side. In January, when Trump is elected, they Maria Corina Machado and her team engage, or no, Maria Corina Machado and her sort of advisors engage the Trump team. Some of the nominees that had already been named. Of course, they hadn't been confirmed yet, but they're already working to try and, put together their policies. Um, they suggest that Nicolas Maduro is using the Tren de Aragua to invade the United States. No, and so this is this is part of a strategy that has been has been sort of a marginal, but has always been there in the within the Venezuelan opposition. I mean, as long as I can remember, I being at a protest in 2003, in other words, 22 years ago, and a woman coming up to me and putting a pin on my lapel that had an American flag and a Venezuelan flag together and recriminating me, sort of half in jest, but recriminating me in saying, how could your country invade Panama and restore democracy, but you're not invading Venezuela? So that was 2003 when that happened. And since then, there's been continual push, So there have been stories about Iranian missile silos in west of Venezuela, the Hezbollah fighters training camps in the east of Venezuela. Venezuela as a source of migration, Venezuela as a source of transnational crime. All of these are efforts by the Venezuelan opposition to say our domestic problem, our domestic, problem with authoritarianism is actually an international problem. You ignore this at your own risk because this is an international problem, destabilizing the region. It's bringing, now drugs and violence and gangs to the United States. So there's very much fits. This very much fits with a long-term trend. It is a marvelous opportunity, and it absolutely catches on. January 20, if you remember, Donald Trump was after his inauguration, he went to the Oval Office and signed a huge stack of executive orders. One of them was put the Tren de Aragua on a list of foreign terrorist organizations, which has a sort of a month cooling period, and then took effect in February 20. Less than a month later, Trump builds on that and says, and invokes the Alien Enemies Act. There's a presidential proclamation that invokes the Alien Enemies Act. This is a law from 1798. From the decades after the U.S. Revolution, basically saying that the United States can take foreign citizens and just deport them without due process because we're in the midst of a war. These are alien enemies, and that we shouldn't have them in our jails or give them due process because we know they're here for terrorist activities, for to wreak havoc, and so we can use it. So this law that is over 200 years old was invoked against the Tren de Aragua, basically saying that Nicolas Maduro was using the Tren de Aragua to invade to invade the United States, as a predatory incursion in the United States. And he admits that. I remember seeing that and just thinking, what a strange curiosity that is. And the very next day, he used it to deport 137 Venezuelan men to El Salvador CCA. That was a group of 250 or so Venezuelan men, some of whom had their deportation hearings and just thought they were being deported to Venezuela. But 137 of them were men that had not had a deportation hearing. All they had was some official had decided that they were Tren de Aragua because they had tattoos or because of something about them. These were usually young men, everything from Michael Jordan tattoos to tattoos of trains, were used as evidence that they were Tren de Aragua. They did not have any hearing. They were put on a plane, thought they were going back to Venezuela, and they ended up in the El Salvador's Center for Terrorist Confinement. So this happens. That very day, there was a federal court sort of blocked the use, a federal judge blocked the usage, but they proceeded anyway in contempt of court. That is something that's still sort of being worked out, whether that was contempt of court. Um, but in several different instances, I won't go through each one of them. From March to April, federal courts blocked the usage of this. Basically, but as these things always work out, of course, there are different procedural issues. Basically, what they did is they ended up saying, this needs to go back to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, because of procedural issues. It doesn't need to be in the Supreme Court yet. And so in September, the beginning of September, a judicial panel, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, ruled against the use of the Alien Enemies Act. And basically Trump administration immediately appealed and got what's called an en banc appeal. Well, that's an appeal with the full, I think there's 16 judges in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal. And basically it's getting a hearing with all of the judges, instead of just this one judicial committee of three. And so all of this, I'm saying this because this is another thing that's going on. This is something that's going on. The Maria Corina Machado and her people. Donald Trump had taken this Tren de Agua idea, instrumentalized it for his campaign because it was perfect for him and his sort of view of what immigration is about. And then uses Alien Enemies Act to facilitate immigration. Now, remember, one of Trump's big promises is to be able to deport 1 million people his first year. And so this is like the ultimate tool because you don't have to bring them to a hearing. You can basically just deport them without further ado. And this would be something that really, really would facilitate, make it much faster. And so this is what's going on. The Trump administration tried to use this Alien Enemy Act. It gets tied up in federal courts. And the reason that the Fifth Circuit of Appeals says this is not happening. This is kind of a reason what people contested from the very beginning. So the Alien Enemies Act is something that you use in time of war. And of course, in time of war is expansive and can be referred to as predatory incursions by another state as well. And so what Trump is doing is he's using this idea of Tren de Agua, and Nicolas Maduro using Nicolas Maduro using the Tren de Agua to invade the United States, among other things, as a way to sort of substantiate this Alien Enemies Act. So this appeal, is currently in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and it was argued in January. I think now it is up. They're writing the decision, which we don't know yet. But in December, the Trump administration basically sent an update to their brief, or sent a briefing that had an update that had current events, and it talked about the military buildup and the sort of the bombing of these boats as demonstrating that there was a conflict with Venezuela. So this is another sort of motivation, a domestic motivation that's involved here. Okay, so in August, at the end of August, there's this Operation Southern Spear starts. This is the largest U.S. naval buildup in decades. There's aircraft carrier group, there's multiple destroyers, there's amphibious assault, there's aircraft available in Puerto Rico and other bases. Venezuela is not that far away. Venezuela is about 3 hours from Miami by flight. And so, some of the planes they actually used in the operation took off from Louisiana. From September to December 2025, there were strikes against go-fast boats. These little boats that are kind of like basically fishing boats, but that have been sort of, made into sort of souped up with 4 motors and are much faster than a regular fishing boat, a little bit bigger too. They basically started bombing these boats in the Caribbean, off the Venezuelan coast, but also off the Colombian coast, and then some in the Pacific as well. In these 4 months, 35 boats were bombed and 100 plus people were killed. And so this is something that is, this is without a hearing. What usually would happen with boats like these is that the Coast Guard or in some cases, armed forces would go and they would, stop them. This is interdiction. They would, at most they would try to they would shoot the motors and like disable the boat, and then they would go and they would check for drugs. And as Senator Rand Paul mentioned, about 25% of the time there were no drugs on these boats. And so, but what they do, they're just summarily shooting these boats and just killing the occupants. Um, their legal justification for this is that they basically said that they were fighting against unlawful enemy combatants. Now we're back to this logic that we have this conflict with Nicolas Maduro, who is using the Trinidad Agua, is using something called the Cartel de los Soles to invade the United States. So, we have these videos of this boat streaming through the water. You don't know where it's going. No, and so that seems quite plausible to the American public. That boom, you blow up these boats, and because they're headed supposedly to the United States. Now, of course, none of those boats were actually headed to the United States because those boats don't go that far. They don't have that range. They could have that range, but they wouldn't have any place for drugs anymore. And so, some of them were headed to Trinidad, some were headed to the Dominican Republic, some were headed to sort of drop off spots out in the middle of the Caribbean. But so they started, knocking off these boats, saying that, these were unlawful enemy combatants. Now, there's a problem with this logic. There's a couple of problems with this logic. First of all, the Cartel de los Soles doesn't exist. Now, this is the first time I wrote about the Cartel de los Soles. In 2008, I wrote a consulting report for a foundation that was interested in, the war on drugs and was funding NGOs in Venezuela. And so they asked me, say, what's going on with this in this Cartel de los Soles? And so back then, it was obvious that this had started in the 1990s, that this was actually a tongue-in-cheek name that some journalists had come up with for the very true fact that there were army officials, or no, there were military officials that were involved in the drug trade. And so they're kind of, the soul means sun. It's kind of like saying the stars. And so it'd be like saying, oh, the Stars and Stripes cartel. Like if some U.S. officials were processed for drug trafficking, some journalists started calling it the Stars and Stripes cartel. And so, but there is no cartel, and there is no Cartel de los Soles. No, it's something that was just sort of a tongue-in-cheek metaphor, but it sort of gained thingness in 2020 when it became part of an indictment of Nicolas Maduro. And of course, what an indictment means is that a prosecutor has gone and convinced some citizens that there is enough evidence for a trial. Not that it's guilty, but that there's enough evidence that this is worth a trial. And so they got an indictment in 2020 that included this idea of Cartel de Soles, although it doesn't really elaborate at all. And I should note that the updated indictment in January of this year, with which they're sort of processing Nicolas Maduro and Ciudad doesn't even mention Cartel de Soles anymore. It just mentions, some relationship with drug trafficking. And so this thing that had been, also over the summer been, defined as a foreign terrorist organization, it doesn't actually exist. There's drug trafficking without a doubt, but it's more the sort of typical situation of drug trafficking in most countries, that you have different networks that end up with sort of tacit agreements of like who has what territory, whatever. But a cartel is something much, much, more organized. It's the idea that you get these different networks that they start articulating to really control prices and markets and defend themselves. And that there is no cartel in Venezuela, much less a cartel of soles. Furthermore, the Trinidad Agua does not engage in maritime drug trafficking. The Trinidad Agua is a prison gang. And if any of you have seen the book I published with some Venezuelan colleagues 2 years ago called The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, there's one chapter there of other Trinidad Agua that we don't actually mention Trinidad Agua there, but it is an ethnography of the prison gang Trinidad Agua from years ago when it was kind of just starting. So Trinidad Agua is a very known entity. It is a prison gang. It's just like Comando Vermelho in Brazil. One of these gangs that ends up using the space of a jail to organize itself outside the jail. It engages in nasty things such as human trafficking, extortion, small scale drug trafficking, but it has no history. There's no recorded history of the Tren de Aragua engaging in maritime drug trafficking. And so a lot of these boats, they were, and the administration kind of interchanges Cartel de los Soles and Tren de Aragua, but oftentimes they would say, oh, these boats are, this is train, we know that this is Tren de Aragua, uh, boat that is headed to the United States. Tren de Aragua doesn't engage. There's no record of them engaging in maritime drug trafficking. In fact, Insight Crime, which is a leading NGO that focuses on crime in the region, basically says that they don't engage in cross-national. They don't actually engage in drug trafficking at that scale. And so that's just largely another. Tren de Aragua actually does exist, but it's not in the way the United States describes. Okay, so that for about 4 months is the justification of Operation Southern Spear. No, this is all about drugs. And of course, as usual, there's a number of, Washington talking heads and think tanks that immediately echo whatever the administration says and start talking about the problem of drug trafficking in the United States. And, I remember one even talking about how the United States needs to focus on sort of bombing dual use facilities, those facilities that are used for military and drug trafficking, which is just nonsense. It's just not, not a thing. It doesn't work at that scale. It doesn't work in that way at all. But, if you're in that environment, that's kind of your job to kind of echo what the U.S. administration is saying. Okay, so in December, a couple of things happen. First of all, there starts to be some pushback within Congress on the Venezuela operation. As well, there is polling that starts to come out showing that there's very little support among the U.S. public for military action against Venezuela. This is very different than the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, in which there was considerable public support. There's very low support for this. 25% or less think that it's a good idea to attack Venezuela. And at this, suddenly there's kind of a pivot. It's like, Donald Trump says, oh, okay, well, actually, what they're going to do is they're blocking the oil. They're blocking these oil tankers. And this is all about recovering our oil. That this is, the United States oil in Venezuela, that they stole it from us. And and of course, Trump, you can never quite take at face value what he says. But it is what he's saying, basically saying that this is our oil. I think what he's referring to is like the nationalization of the oil industry back in the 70s, and then again by Hugo Chavez in the 2000s. And so then suddenly, that changes the whole equation. And we hear from that time on, we hear very little about drugs anymore. In this, it's basically about, Nicolas Maduro and oil. Okay. So that kind of changes course. Okay. So nevertheless, at the beginning of this year, as you all know, there's an invasion, and so this is something this surprised a lot of us. I watched all these things pretty close, and it certainly wasn't a shock. It was something that we all knew could happen. But I kind of thought from mid-December on, I kind of thought, okay, we're in a new stage, which I was very fearful of, a new stage of an oil blockade of Venezuela, and to try and starve out Nicolas Maduro as well as the Venezuelan population is what I was concerned about. And so I woke up on that Saturday morning and I was really quite surprised. But it was always within the possibilities. And so wake up and get informed and start talking to journalists. The biggest shock, I think, of the day was when Trump comes on in his press conference and he basically says that they're going to be working with Delcy Rodriguez and that he's not going to be working with Maria Corina Machado because she's not respected in the country. No, and this is quite a shock because this is the person who led this electoral effort that basically led landslide electoral win at the end of July in 2024 and had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and had just had the ceremony in December. And so saying that she's not respected is, it's actually not correct. I think you objectively say that it's not true, that she's not respected. I'll get back to what maybe actually meant by that. But so that is like the biggest shock. In fact, this was such a shock that a lot of sort of my Venezuelan colleagues, not my Venezuelan colleagues, but a lot of sort of the people that were closest to Maria Corina and sort of most invested in her, you know, her political movement immediately thought that he had misspoken, that Trump had gotten confused and had said Maria Corina Machado when he met Delcy Rodriguez, and then said Delcy Rodriguez when he met Maria Corina Machado. That had to be because it was so shocking to them. It was shocking to me, but you can just imagine for them. The but it was readily apparent though in the within hours that no, he had not misspoken. That's actually what was happening, and he had high praise for Delcy Rodriguez, seeing that she was a good person and they were going to work with her. And as this moves along, January 7, Rubio went and briefed Congress. He spoke there of three steps: stabilization, recovery, and the democratic transition. No, in January 28, he talks about the just this past week he testified in the Senate, and he said that the end goal was a friendly, stable, prosperous Venezuela and democratic. Kind of, and that's actually a quote, said it that way. And so he gave no time frames for when it would be democratic or when the transition would happen. He gave no gave no real promises when or how this would happen either. He did mention a couple of things that are quite interesting. He mentioned that he mentions a couple of things about opposition. He mentioned reconciliation with Chavistas, no? And so Trump has actually mentioned this twice as well, that the United States might try to sit down all sides and have them try to work together. No, he also Rubio also talked about the unification and professionalization of the opposition, talked about how diverse the opposition is and how they need to get move beyond a protest movement and kind of talk about what governing should be. So these were quite interesting and sort of surprising statements. Now, at the same time, in January, there's been some really interesting, some really solid coverage by the major, newspapers, the international coverage, Washington Post and New York Times and Wall Street Journal, that have looked at this decision, and what they have come up with and shown is that the Trump administration, I think, realistically listened to a CIA report, listened to many of us who had been saying all fall that this would be a disaster if they just tried to sort of, to lop off Chavismo and install Maria Corina Machado, because you didn't have sort of the networks into the country. You can't, and so what we saw last fall is that her advisors would write op-eds and she would talk on media and whatnot and basically say, oh no, the Venezuelan people are unified. 70% of the people voted for us, even on the military basis. And once you get rid of Nicolas Maduro, they're all going to be willing to collaborate with us. But at the same time, she would say that, the armed forces were actually a drug cartel. It just seemed very improbable. And so the Trump administration, to its credit, seemed to listen to, at least they listened to the CIA reports. And I think the CIA reports were likely, listening to the coverage in which many of us had said these things. So, and one of the things they said, and this came out in the New York Times, was that, it was this sort of divisiveness, this inability to work with the broader opposition. Because Venezuela, Maria Corina's opposition is a large coalition now, but there's also a much more moderate part of the opposition, and there's even a part of the opposition that's actually in power in Venezuela and is much closer and is willing to work with Chavismo. Then there's dissident Chavismo, and then there's like Chavismo in power. And so their inability to kind of work with a broader coalition of the opposition and to talk with Chavismo, is something that was taken into account. In that decision to just not just do like Iraq and just try to, go through this de-Ba'athification process, but try to actually, have a process that's a little bit, stepwise. I mean, I think, whatever happens, they kind of have the temporality. I think they're correct on. Okay, so. But there's some tension points, So this looks actually pretty good. If these three steps, stabilization, recovery, and democratic transition, as I say, that's actually, that's pretty consistent with a lot of, a lot of the literature on democratic transitions and the literature on peacemaking processes would actually talk more or less about these steps and say that it can't just be a point where we're used to thinking, the Berlin Wall falls and it's a new government. That's, it's, transitions are actually usually processes, and so this doesn't sound too bad, if this was happening, but there are some tension points here, Uh, first of all, and probably the biggest one is that Donald Trump has a uniquely vigorous or strong hold on his government. Donald Trump, too, and on this second administration, uh, has a really strong hold on his officials. And what he says goes. And Donald Trump does not have a history of being interested in democracy and human rights. No, he look at Ukraine. He kind of sees it as this battle between two powers, and it doesn't, seem to see that there's, this problem of sovereignty and democracy involved or human rights. His national security strategy that was emitted at the end of November, beginning of December, barely mentions democracy. And so, and needless to say, within the United States, he's done a lot to damage democracy. If you maybe probably saw The Economist, their graphic showing that the United States has had a faster democratic deterioration than many of the other, cases such as Hungary, or Turkey, or others. And so the idea that then he's going to use his political capital for democracy, perhaps he might just be satisfied with this once we get to the stabilized oil production with U.S. companies in there and kind of lose interest in it. Uh, Rubio, on the other hand, he actually seems more interested in Cuba. I mean, I think Marco Rubio is kind of the key person with this policy. Trump is in charge, but Rubio is the one that's really kind of carrying this ahead. But he really, I think he has his eyes on the real prize for him, and that is Cuba. And so perhaps he can start working on that, leave Venezuela as it is, and start working on Cuba. No, and sort of if we think about Donald Trump's first year's kind of peak of his political capital, he's now 15, 16 points underwater. The popularity is around 41%, 41%. Not good for midterm elections. No, people think he's not paying attention to the economy. And so this is something that, for example, Brantley Womack is called, I should say asymmetry of attention. That he talks about how peripheral countries like Venezuela, Guatemala, or other countries oftentimes can kind of out navigate and sort of out navigate the United States or big powers because they're spending all their attention like figuring out what the United States is doing and planning. Whereas Trump and Rubio, have their hands in 100 different fires, and don't pay as much attention. And so we could just see if things start getting more complicated, or if they successfully stabilize the oil economy, perhaps they're not all that interested anymore. Okay, so here's the opposition dilemma. And I'll end with this: the dilemma and an alternative. Basically, Venezuelan opposition, and by this I mean kind of the Mayoría Corina, I think, is the undisputed leader of the opposition right now, but it is a broader coalition, and you can imagine other leadership emerging. Venezuela's opposition could stay the course, and this is, supporting Trump and his actions. But of course, the risk there is that you're just leaving it to Donald Trump with, the provisos I just mentioned, and a democratic transition might not happen. It might just be, we might just have, the new Saudi Arabia and the Caribbean. Donald Trump seems like he would be quite comfortable with that. Or they could push back, they could try and broaden their international engagement. She could, Maria Corina Machado could use the prestige of the Nobel Prize and meet with other foreign leaders and sort of basically say this can't be. We have to, we have to have control here. We are the elected leaders, and how can you work with Chavismo? But of course, here the risk is crossing Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, and anyone who crosses him, this is the way he keeps power. Is that he basically tries to have the maximum consequences for anybody that crosses him. Well, there's some exceptions to that we could talk about, but that is a risk. That's a real risk. So far, it's very clear that Maria Corina Machado has opted for the former strategy. She's after about a 48-hour silence, after Trump saying that she's not respected, they sort of dusted themselves off, basically praised the operation, said this is the start. They've really grabbed onto Marco Rubio's three-stage plan, and analysts that are close to Maria Corina, daily are coming out with these messy different signs that the United States is moving towards a democratic transition. Some of it, is really stretching the data, but you can understand how that's what they're trying to do. She, of course, you probably saw, she went and gave the Nobel Peace Prize medal to Trump, which generated really just a great set of memes and about people giving him the prizes. And so she's done that, tried to appease Trump, but she also just absolutely stayed with her message. She has not altered her message whatsoever. If you look at the interview that came out of Face the Press yesterday, which actually was taped on Friday, but was probably transmitted or broadcast yesterday, she continued to refer to Chavismo as power, as a cartel. She even said that she couldn't honor the contracts that were currently being uh, hammered out because this is a cartel. These are criminal bosses. She as well. One of the sort of undersides of her whole campaign effort in 2024 was they had sort of a team of influencers that basically anybody that sort of contradicted her messaging on the elections, or the idea that they were going to a win, or the idea that they didn't have to negotiate, would then be attacked, and ad hominem attacks, not attacks on the substance of their arguments, but basically have their integrity intact. And that's still going on. Basically, that has not changed. All the same influencers are basically trying to berate anybody that has a different idea about opposition strategy, or anybody that in some way criticizes, Machado, or suggests that things have not turned out the way she thought. No, and so what we're seeing, right, this really sort of remarkable situation in which you know they they basically sort of gave Trump, it, I wrote a piece on this in Time Magazine that was published in November. Um, Basically, what they did is they used the opposition used the Ahmed Chalabi strategy of like giving information, even misinformation, to the Trump administration about how Venezuela was a threat to the U.S. national security, and basically saying you need to get rid of this threat, using it just like Ahmed Chalabi said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. René Correa Machado said time and again that Nicolas Maduro has said trained Nicaragua to invade the United States and bring drugs and crime to violence to the United States. Um, and it worked. It worked. It got the U.S. to invade. So they instrumentalized U.S. military power. But Donald Trump also instrumentalized them. Basically, he took this message and has used it for his sort of first used it as for his anti-immigrant strategy, basically using the Concept Train Nicaragua, and trotting out the Alien Enemies Act, and then using this, one of the motivations, and this has been covered in both Washington Post and the New York Times. One of the motivations of this whole conflict with Venezuela is to provide some substance for this court case that is, the Alien Enemies Act, which will greatly facilitate their ability to sort of deport people without a trial. So, and now it's been sort of repurposed. I don't actually think it's all about oil. I think it's all about sort of the national security strategy and trying to dominate this hemisphere and having this resource-rich country strategically aligned with the United States instead of Russia and China. So Donald Trump has also repurposed them, I think. Okay, so last slide. What is an alternative? So the alternative could be that Machado and other leaders of opposition, could show themselves to be leaders on their own, as having agency on their own. They could lead a process of opposition unification. They could have, the great Venezuelan opposition, for democracy and freedom conference and try to demonstrate that they can reconcile, they can build a big tent and do not have to do not have to have a consensus, but rather they can have a processual unity, a unity that's based on having clear mechanisms for conflict resolution and making decisions. They could show themselves with the ability to talk to Chavista leaders. They could talk, or they could have some high profile phone calls and report those to the press and try to demonstrate. Because both Marco Rubio and Donald Trump have been saying, well, this is what we kind of need to see. This is what we don't see. This is why this opposition has been marginalized. They could show that they have concrete ideas about how a transition could take place. No, realistic ideas, step-by-step ideas, and not just, this ethereal idea that we won the election, therefore everybody's just going to like throw flowers on the street as Maria Corina Machado goes to the Miraflores presidential palace. So ideas about what has to take place, and I know there are some ideas, and show that they have ideas about how to actually govern the country. And those I know that they have and there've been moments and they put forward these white papers, but they need to have some more. They have to do this again and say, well, this is how we could do it. This is what could happen with oil, and show that they could, that they can actually pull this off. Okay, or that they could actually be a reliable partner, just like how Trump sees Delcy Rodriguez as being. Okay, so thank you very much. If you're interested in more, there's I have a Substack called Venezuela in the United States that opened in September, and you're welcome to go. It's entirely free. Subscribe there, and you'll get whatever, whenever I have an interview or something that I can paste in there, I will put it in there. Thank you very much. Happy to receive questions.
Thank you so much. So as a reminder for our audience, you can use the raise your hand function, and then we can unmute you and you can speak, or you can enter a question into the chat or the Q&A. We already have a question in the Q&A, so I'll go ahead and read that off as people are kind of formulating their questions. And this question is from Yatin or Jatin Mirsai, and asks, regarding the mention of Iran, do you think the supposed revelation of the Iranian shadow fleet and the axis of resistance was part of the rationale for invasion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you had a situation that Venezuela had these, sanctions that they had sort of learned to live with. And one of the ways they had learned to live with them was through this whole dark fleet, this dark fleet that different sanctioned countries have been able to use to export their oil and commercialize their oil. So that's part of it. And I think more broadly, if you look at the national security strategy, there is this idea that the United States should dominate the Western Hemisphere. And what they don't want is they don't want Venezuela to be part of this network with Iran, Russia, and China that competes. These are authoritarian countries that are sort of on the margins or see themselves as competitors with Western countries. And so I think, not Iran particularly, but more broadly. And so one of the things that they've demanded of the Delcy Rodriguez government is that they sort of break strategic ties with Iran, Russia and China, something that's going to be really difficult. I think that's one of the more difficult elements of this, much more difficult than just getting the oil industry going again, because they have concrete, important relationships. China has, Venezuela has a lot of debt to China. China has legitimate economic interests in Venezuela. Russia has all sorts of military collaborations with Venezuela, and Iran, was quite instrumental in getting gasoline production going again in Venezuela, and so there are still collaborative agreements. So it's not just something that they can just suddenly, do a press release and say, "Hey, we're not friends with you anymore." There's like actual tangible people on the ground, and configurations and collaborations, that investments that they're have a long track record and sort of need to keep going if they want things to be sustainable.
Okay, I see that we have a hand up in the questions from Iran Franco. So give me 2 seconds and you can talk now. So please ask your question.
Thank you. Very interested in the presentation. Thank you. So I just wanted to quickly make first a quick comment, and then to ask two questions. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is that you talked about the anti-immigration campaign sentiments that characterize the recent elections, but we also know as political scientists, I'm a graduate student, we also saw and know that Latino support for Trump raised substantially, and it, based on some estimates, it even got the largest share of Latino votes ever since they started to measure in exit polls. So, and also I remember personally the one story, a news story about the Doral community in Florida, where you see a lot of Venezuelans, not all of them are citizens, but when Trump campaigned there and he touted his anti-immigration rhetoric, etc., that he received a lot of good reactions there. Even in Venezuelan communities in the U.S., it's interesting if you have any thought about that, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. But it also is related also to what we saw after Maduro was captured. I was in Bogota, coincidentally at that time, and I saw a lot of Venezuelans, celebrating. And this is, less of a puzzle because we can understand it. If many of them, escaped Venezuela because of the situation, they would be happy about it. But so it's a little bit related to that. Maybe it just tells us that, it's a little bit, more complex than we might think, even in the eyes of Latinos in the U.S. and in Latin America, even more generally. But the two questions, if I may, the first one is, to what extent do you think it would be possible to see a unified government between opposition and and the current government with the opposition? Because these days are special. We see that some interesting developments are happening. And the second question, uh, what do you think about what happened with Delcy Rodriguez? Isn't it a little bit peculiar and strange that everything went so smoothly? I mean, I have some thoughts that I mean, the thing that I wanted to hear your thoughts about. Do you think that it is possible that maybe there was any cooperation between the U.S. government with Delcy Rodriguez, even more than just talking? Because Rubio mentioned that he talked with before they captured Maduro, but maybe there was more than that. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Yeah, those are both really good questions and comments. And I'll take the second one first because that's an easier one, I think. Yeah, I mean, there's been all sorts of speculation about this. It's like, really, how does this happen with, there's like no U.S. casualties and such a smooth sort of transition. And so a number of people have said that this was an inside job. That maybe they had sacrificed Maduro and agreed to this. I tend to not think it was that tangible. I don't think that they agreed to a U.S. invasion. No, but I just came across just today an article from December saying that Nicolas Maduro had offered to Trump that Delcy Rodriguez could become president and then they could move to go towards elections. No, so that was already in the works. That was already, and they had this channel through Qatar that apparently there was, communications that were happening. And so is it like this big surprise of like, wow, how did this happen? What a surprise. This was kind of like something that had been floated on each side, and they had some communication with Delcy Rodriguez. So I don't really think that they had agreed upon that this was organized ahead of time. Um, but I do think that these possibilities, that Maduro would leave and Delcy Rodriguez would be, president, I think they had gone through that, and everyone had thought about that in some way, talked about it. So that made it a really smooth transition. Now, I will say that one thing that really caught my eye was that the first high U.S. official to head of the United States was the head of the CIA, and so that and he was received by Delcy Rodriguez, and so that would just kind of blew my mind. And that kind of made me think, well, maybe this was an inside job. No, I still don't quite think so. I just I have a hard time imagining that, but I think it's an open history, and hopefully we'll find out more at some point. But at this point, I think it was something that was kind of in the air, that there had been talks between U.S. officials, and there had been this offer of like Delcy Rodriguez as president and going to elections. Um, and so, they kind of acted upon that. And I think, also the invasion happened, and they didn't come out with statements or anything for like 5 hours or so, 4 or 5 hours afterwards. You would think that immediately it would come out with, statements for calm. The only person that came out immediately was Diosdado Cabello, who's kind of the strong man of the regime, going out. He was like surrounded by colectivos and our militia. And so, the way it happened, it makes me think it wasn't, concretely worked out, but it was kind of in the air that transition from Maduro to Rodriguez could happen. Now, your other question is a really interesting one, and it's a difficult one, and that is sort of it was really kind of your statement, or portrait of the situation. And it's absolutely true. I mean, on the one hand, I think one thing is the Latino support for Trump. I think a lot of that was sort of conjunctural, and recent polls have shown that has completely cratered after ICE. And I think the sort of the more interesting part is Venezuelan support for Donald Trump. They voted for Trump in sort of the highest um, percentage of any ethnic group in the United States in the 2024 elections, and they have sort of stuck with supporting Donald Trump, despite the fact that multiple times he has tried to cancel temporary protected status, basically making a bunch of things illegal, despite the fact that he has used the Alien Enemies Act, saying that all these guys were, trained in Aragua, despite the fact that that came with, all kinds of descriptions of Venezuelans as sort of gangbangers. He said some just horrendous things about Venezuelans, but everyone has sort of seen that as well. Maybe that's kind of the price you have to pay for freedom of our country. And I think that's understandable. And on one hand, I personally think that this whole episode is sets a horrendous precedent. No, it's a violation of international law. No, it very directly violates the UN Charter. No, it's a really bad precedent. I think it also sort of it undermines Venezuelan politics. I think already in countries in the Caribbean, including Venezuela, one of the things that represents a centrifugal force in in Venezuela is the idea that, well, maybe we could get intervention. That would just be easier. As I said, this has been going, this as a theory of change has been going on for 20 years in Venezuela. No, and one of the reasons that many in the opposition never have seen the necessity of engaging Chavismo, or trying to sort of, grab their rhetoric or their plans or whatever, some have, but most have not, is that they always think, well, it would another alternative, instead of dealing with these people, is to get international intervention, get international sanctions, get international pressure to get rid of these people. No, it's a mechanism of change that has happened, you know, any number of times in Latin American history, and it represents a centrifugal force on Latin American politics. That means that people are less likely to negotiate and figure out a way to get along with each other. I mean, here, we have Trump, and a lot of people are sort of organizing, but there's nobody that's like trying to say, well, let's get Russia to intervene, or let's get, the UK or France to intervene. That's just not on the map. It's not going to happen. And so what do you have to do? You have to figure out how you can combat this, how you can try to speak how you can speak to these people who voted for Trump in 2024, no, so that maybe you fare better in 2028. But if you have this possibility that you could always have some kind of international intervention, well, that means it's less likely you're willing to negotiate. So I think I think on that level, that's very, very negative. However, for Venezuelans, and I should say that I'm a Venezuelan resident, and I've lived in Venezuela 16 of the past 30 years. I have all kinds of ties, in Venezuela. My life is basically in Venezuela. And so I very much kind of understand it. Um, you know, what does this mean? Well, this means, what did it look like before this? What it looked like is that this was going to be the trajectory of Cuba, and we were going to have decades of basically immiserated population with no democratic rights in inability to change anything. No, and so now you have this opening, no, and you've actually seen there's some movement for political prisoners, and you have this possibility, you have at least this spark, and so of course people are jubilant, and the larger issues of what this means internationally are not all that important to them. And I understand that too, because, this is not, the failure didn't begin here. No, there's a failure of the liberal international order, liberal world order before this. Basically, this has been going on, if we just start with Maduro, this every year democratic, erosion happens worse and worse. There have been efforts to go to elections, protest movements, the Internet Carta Democrática, Michelle Bachelet, and the Human Rights Council. Every sort of international mechanism has been used. Of course, you can always say, well, they used it wrong, or didn't do the protests right, or didn't negotiate right, or whatever. But all of them have been used, and nothing has availed to try and reestablish or return to democracy in Venezuela. And so I mean, people kind of feel like, well, the international order, you can talk about that all day long, but it completely failed us. And so why are we now going to say, oh no, this is a terrible precedent? This is an opportunity. And so I think of these things at multiple levels, and both things can be true. I think this is a terrible precedent. No, it's a terrible thing. I think it's going to have long-term damage, Latin American politics in general. At the same time, I think that there's an opportunity here, and I totally understand that Venezuelans that are grateful for this.
We have a number of questions that are in the Q&A, so I'll read the first of those. But of course, people who still have questions, feel free to raise your hand or enter them in the Q&A. The first of our Q&A questions comes from Liam Quimby, who asks, Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro are the latest examples of the quote-unquote pink revolution in Latin America. With the abduction of Maduro in January, where does that leave the movement? Will the socialist experiments end with him and the rise of Trump's enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, or might it continue in other Latin American countries?
Okay, so I'll try to be a little short in my answer so we can get to some more. But that said, I'm happy to stay here as long as you want. Yeah, I think that, and I've long been critical of Hugo Chavez's turn to socialism, to his type of sort of social experiences. I thought that it was going to lead to a concentration of power. That's exactly what happened. And I thought that this is something that is going to undermine, left movements more broadly. And so I think, what we've seen is that indeed, Chavismo is trotted out in many elections across the region. Basically, and anybody that has anything that's from social democracy left is accused of Chavismo, and that has had an impact, but kind of minimal actually. If you think about it, we've in Mexico we've had two successive governments that are center left. That are also from outside of the leading coalition, yeah, or leading political elite, and Sheinbaum was actually quite popular. The Chile had another left experience. Boric, that recently left off. I don't know if he's left office yet, but so you've seen a number of back and forth. So I actually think that this does not mean, I think, perhaps it means, and I kind of hope it means the end of, or, at least a diminishing of this kind of Leninist type socialism, the kind of like the socialism that doesn't respect democratic institutions, and thinks that, it has to kind of concentrate all power, that, it's a unified country. I mean, that kind of sort of Leninist type socialism, in Chavismo's, 21st century socialism was this weird animal that was kind of like had this facade of democracy, but also had the Leninist ideology. I do hope that has, become somewhat discredited, because I think that that's something that has undermined left movements any number of times. But more broadly, we've seen Boric, we've seen Lula come back, we've seen Petro, Scheinbaum. So we've seen any number of left experiences, but they do tend to be left experiences that very clearly say that, we are left in a sense that we're looking for structural reforms, but we're democratic. And so I think that's good.
Our next question is from Marina Moscoso, who asks, what do you think will happen to Maduro?
Well, it's really interesting. This is also sort of evidence that they had clearly thought about this ahead of time, this possibility. Because he was taken to New York, and his first court date, he immediately said, "I am a prisoner of war." And so that is kind of the first line of defense of saying, his defense lawyers are going to be saying, "Well, actually, no, this is illegal. He's a prisoner of war. He's a president functioning. This trial cannot even actually happen." So we'll see if that defense works or not. After that, I think, he will be tried for drug trafficking. And in being tried for drug trafficking is very broad. It doesn't mean that you're the guy there that's like sending drugs everywhere. But if you are somebody that basically will say, take a bribe and tell the National Guard to not pay attention to the trucks that are going to the airplanes, you're tried as a drug trafficker. And my understanding is that there's some pretty good evidence on him. I don't know about Celia Flores, but that there's some pretty good evidence that he will, if it gets down to that, if he actually stands trial on these things, he probably will be convicted, I think, of drug trafficking, and probably have a fate similar to Manuel Noriega, who ended up, spending the rest of his days in the U.S. jail. We'll see. Any number of things could happen. But I have heard from credible sources that they have pretty good evidence on, this broad definition of drug trafficking, that he, knowingly allowed drug trafficking to happen. But we'll first have to see what happens with this defense that he's a prisoner of war.
Okay. Our next question is from Lelis Bravo. She says, thank you for your presentation. You talk a lot about invasion, but U.S. officials instead talk about extraction of Maduro and his wife. Could you please elaborate more on this difference?
Yeah. So that is, if you look at the videos and whatnot, this is what you would call an invasion. And so there were actually 150 aircraft. There's 100 people or so killed on the ground. They went in and they grabbed Nicolas Maduro, put him in a wife, and put them in a helicopter and took them away and left. And so this was a major military operation that would normally be called invasion. They're calling it law enforcement. They're basically saying that the U.S. Armed forces, what they did was penetrate Venezuela so that law enforcement could arrest Nicolas Maduro and his wife. And why are they phrasing it that way? Because they did this without congressional oversight. And so this is something that would really stretch the idea of, they also use this rhetoric of unlawful enemy combatant to blow up all these boats to avoid congressional oversight. And they said they said to Congress, and of the few times that they actually went there, they said, we are not going to invade Venezuela. And so they did this without telling Congress, and this is their way of saying, "Oh, it wasn't an invasion. No, it was actually just law enforcement." And so, yeah, it's their way of sort of rhetorically um, avoiding congressional scrutiny, which, it's a pretty low bar since they have, Republican control of both houses of Congress. Um, what's interesting about this is that, you know, as I said, this case um, in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was argued in January. I understand these are not public arguments, but they're argued in January, and the whole deal here is that the Trump administration, wants to be able to use this Alien Enemies Act, which is something that's used in a time of war, uh, tweaking it to say, well, it's predatory incursion. But at the same time, they want to avoid congressional review by saying, well, actually, no, this wasn't war. This was law enforcement. So those two logics kind of go against each other, And so we'll see how it shakes out. We'll see if the District Court of Appeals takes that into account or not, or if they just say, oh no, the U.S. is at war, well, you can use this if you want. When the administration is saying, actually, no, it wasn't a war. It was just law enforcement. So, contradictory rhetorics, for political purposes, and we'll see how it shakes out.
Our next question comes from David Vieni, who says, thank you for your thoughts. We hosted you years ago at Ciencias Sociales UCAB. What are your sources for saying that Machado's people approached candidate Trump in 2024 to talk about the Tren de Aragua, open borders, and narco trafficking?
Yeah, that is actually, you can look that up in a Reuters report by Sarah Kanosian. I know she worked on this for 5 months, and that must have come out in November, maybe. And you can look at my Time magazine article that I wrote about this, and I linked to her article. So she's the one that kind of broke that story, and others have repeated it. And she has people on record stating that in pretty good confirmation of that. I know she spent a lot of time on that. So yeah, that's it. Reuters reported that, I think, in November.
And we have our next question from Danielle Schun, who says, thank you so much for the very informative and thoughtful presentation. I have Venezuelan family, and they are very supportive of Machado and therefore of Trump's actions. I have struggled to convince them to see how Trump's actions in the U.S. are being legitimized by rhetoric that Machado herself has created or encouraged about Tren de Aragua. Of course, I deeply sympathize with their celebration of Maduro's capture after decades of political and economic decline. However, I can't celebrate the degradation of democracy in the U.S. for the supposed cause of saving democracy in Venezuela. Is there any path forward that could result in reestablishing democracy in Venezuela at this point, if other Western powers got involved, or is Trump their only hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with basically everything you just said. And I would point to if you look at my Substack, or just search on my name and online publication called The Dispatch, which is actually sort of a Republican sort of center-right publication that asks me to write for them once in a while. That's what I argued. I basically argued that Operation Southern Spear was a threat to U.S. democracy because basically the way it was being, carried out was part of a larger militarization of U.S. society and an undermining of democratic review of it. So I totally agree with you there. So your question, is there a way that we could get to democracy? I think, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think, if I were Machado, what I would do is, hold some kind of conference, to show that, you're the big tent opposition, that she can work with everybody, demonstrate that you can work with Chavismo, demonstrate that you understand the stepwise process of a transition, and that can, that you could preside over that. That's Maria Corina Machado. I mean, I think that, she receives a lot of credit for her persistence for going to the election in 2024. I honestly, I do not respect at all, her mechanisms in 2025. I think that they, criminalized and stigmatized populations that, are less advantaged populations of Venezuelans. And he never corrected that. She never called for the release of the guys in um what's it called in Secot, and so all that rhetoric I think was really really just unconscionable to me. So I don't support that, but I do think more broadly, what she has really shown is a lot of courage and a lot of sort of desire for a return to democracy. And so, I give her a lot of credit for that. But she's not all there is. There's a whole democratic movement. There's a huge opposition in any number of capable, important people. I mean, I think first of all, what Venezuelans have to do, yeah, I mean, so I just say, I do not think that this is going to happen just on the basis of Donald Trump and Marco Rubio. I think that's a pipe dream. Just look at Donald Trump's record. Look at what he's doing right now in the United States. Look at what he's doing in Ukraine. Look at what he's doing in other places. And to think that he's somehow going to burn his political capital trying to install democracy in Venezuela, something that could turn out wrong, I can't see it. I can imagine maybe Marco Rubio, but also, Marco Rubio, you know, uh, it, he's unrecognizable. I mean, he seems like one of those zombie ants with a fungus controlling it. He basically his current stances are his stances for 10 years ago are unrecognizable. And so I have a hard time imagining he's going to put his political capital on the line either. No, it could happen, but odds are it's not going to happen. What needs to happen, whether it's Maria Corina Machado or someone else, or preferably Venezuelans in general, have to demand this, have to sort of speak out, have to protest, have to write, have to do everything saying this needs to be a democratic transition, not just a transition to a new Saudi Arabia. This needs to be a democratic transition. Without that, it's not going to happen. No, I think it absolutely could happen. No, and I think there are even sectors in Chavismo that would be willing to have this happen. But it's got to be demanded. It's got to be demanded in a way that's astute and channels the different sort of segments of the Venezuelan opposition and engages Chavismo in a broader coalition. It definitely could happen.
Okay, I think we just have two questions left. So next is from Carlos Torrelli, who asks, how different is this operation to the killing of bin Laden, which could have been termed an extraction had he not been killed? Does that make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think, bin Laden was not the head of a country. No, that did not mean a regime change. He was not in control of Pakistan or Afghanistan at that point. And so, um, that was more, anti-terrorist type operation. Whereas Maduro was the acting head of a country, and he was president. He was an illegitimate president, but he was the president nonetheless. And sovereignty doesn't sovereignty in international law doesn't depend on the sovereign being democratic. No, it was still a violation of international law. Whereas the sort of the killing of Osama bin Laden, I understand, actually happened with the agreement of the Pakistani authorities. So I think it was quite different in multiple senses.
Okay. And then we just have a quick follow-up from David, and then I'll get to you, Gisela. So David asks, or he says, thanks for the citation. If I may ask, what is your opinion on Hugo Caraval's open letter to Trump dated December 2nd, 2025?
Yeah, I mean, that was the guy who was up for sentencing, and so I think the truth value of what Hugo Carvajal says is really weak. I mean, it's like people, this is basically Trump has pardoned, hundreds of people, and oftentimes because they come with adulatory praise for him and tell him what he wants, and so So I think that's the letter you're referring to, Hugo Carvajal. If there was something after that, but so I don't give any truth value to anything that Hugo Carvajal says in a letter in which he's trying to seek some kind of pardon from Trump. I mean, that doesn't hold much water for me.
Okay, there's just one quick clarification, Gisela, and then you can ask, but Yatin has clarifying that Pakistan did not authorize the
Oh,
raid and
okay.
complained about it after it happened.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think
Eh,
that's a threat. That's a violation of sovereignty as well. I mean, I think it's somewhat lesser than basically rendering the president of Pakistan, and saying that we're going to invade again if you don't do what we do, and having sort of this tutelary presence over it. But there's still this violation of sovereignty, and this goes back to you know. The United States does these things and feels like it has a right to do these things. And so, I think all of this is are things that are quite problematic. No, I think they're difficult. It's not simplified, but they are difficult issues.
okay. Gisela.
Yeah, so thank you so much, David. This was fantastic. So, I'm trying to think on this transition and how, how it can happen, and what is how they can, maybe commit to not prosecute the military, not prosecute the Chavismo, to let them
Mhm.
be. You know, how do you guarantee such a thing? In many countries, they prosecute after that, and
Yeah,
years
yeah,
after, there's a law, and they reverse whatever decision. And what do you think is the role of the military now, and where,
yeah,
because they were extremely involved, and unless they change their position, the situation was not going anywhere. And also the military, but the colectivos too, um, which
yeah.
have a lot of power.
Yeah, well, I think those are all really, really good questions. And what has happened so far is the easy stuff. They basically say, "Oh, wow, this is great. Chavismo's collaborating," but this is all stuff that they wanted anyway. This is, so far with the oil industry, the reason that U.S. oil majors are not there is that U.S. sanctions, and so they never wanted those companies to leave. They never wanted international industry to leave, and so this has all been quite easy for them. And, Delcy Rodriguez, for example, has been somebody that's been arguing for reform of the hydrocarbon law long before this. And so this is kind of an opportunity. And so that all, took place on fast track. It was quite easy. Political prisoners, that's pretty easy too. No, it's not logistically a huge task um, to do it. But once you get to things like, how are you going to pacify? How are you going to kind of demilitarize Venezuela? That gets very difficult. I mean, I think already the issue of like how do you if they're obliged to break ties with Iran and Russia and China, how's that going to happen? That's a difficult issue. But then, how do you pacify with all of these with a very armed society, with this huge armed forces, and then the colectivos and the militia, and then these armed groups, and there's guerrilla fighters in large parts of the country, and there's illicit markets with armed gangs. So how do you pacify those? That's not an easy task, and I think there's got to be some kind of stepwise plan of doing it. One thing that actually sort of helps is that the Venezuelan military, this was a historic humiliation. I mean, they weren't able to shoot down one plane. I mean, not even by accident. And so this was just, they really showed a complete lack of operative, ability to defend Venezuela. And so, Vladimir Padrino Lopez is still in power, but the, you know, his status, I think, has taken a hit. And so we'll see if there's some kind of efforts. Now, the issue here is Delcy Rodriguez government actually interested in this? No, it doesn't seem so far that they're interested in really significant reform. No, what in the Wall Street Journal had a good article just a couple of days ago that they are basically what they're trying to do is, kind of wait it out, sort of like, keep your head low, do what Trump wants, sort of slow walk the political reforms until Trump is out of office or completely distracted on something else, and then they can kind of, revive, kind of take control. And they've always thought that if they can have, Chavismo has always thought if they can have uh, a government, a country without sanctions, their model will work. No, I mean, I disagree with that. I think that their model is flawed. Their economic model is flawed. Their political model is flawed. But they've always thought, oh, their internal discourse is, oh, it's because of the sanctions. Because of sanctions starting 2017 and then 2019, 2020, that, everything went down. If we just get out from under those, things will work out okay again. So they're trying to, that's what their hope is, that they can keep a lid on things. And so uh and stay in power. I mean, if you look at, another change that could be really easy, is like lifting the blocks on digital web portals. Now, all this Venezuela has this great collage of of independent media that are really quite good, but most people in Venezuela can't access them, unless they have a VPN, which most people don't really know how to use, or they don't have enough internet power to really motor it. Um, so, those are easy things. But that what you say, I mean, I think there are processes of Colombia is a case in which there have been processes that are very difficult of sort of pacification or demobilization. I think the real key to this would be to get the judicial system operative again. 80% of Venezuela's judges are temporary, they're not tenured judges. If you could actually have like real judges in a reformed judicial system that could push along security reform that would demobilize some of these groups, sort of maybe, as it is, the Venezuelan armed forces is very divided between sort of the coup proofing uh, effort that they did, Maduro did to kind of keep the army from unified, also leads them to be kind of vulnerable units. You can imagine, a process of paring away a number of these units, but it's a really delicate tightrope. But I think, that is kind of the hardest issue. I think the hardest issue is that one of security, and then actually going to democratic elections with actual democratic institutions and an actual electoral council that would work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's all the questions that our audience had. So I would like to ask everybody to join me in thanking David for what was a fantastic talk and a fantastic discussion. And thank you so much for your time
All right.
and for teaching us all so much.
Oh, well, thank you for the invitation. It was a lot of fun, and I really appreciated the questions. Were all really good questions. Gave me a lot to think about.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. And we will
All
have
right.
the recording also in our
Okay,
website.
great. Yeah, send me the recording, and I'll put it on my Substack as well. Publicize
Okay,
it there.
great.
Fantastic.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.